the Falkland Islands, a bleak and open space now littered with the relics of an unwelcome war. A war that put homely British names like Goose Green, Bluff Cove, Mount Tumbledown, Mount Longdon into the battle honours of British regiments more accustomed to fighting on foreign soil. And a war that, as ever, left its mark on the men and women who found themselves unexpectedly caught up in it. A British military helicopter retraces a famous flight into Port Stanley. A year ago, as the final battles of the campaign were fought beneath, Major General Sir Jeremy Moore, who led the British land forces, was on his way to accept the Argentine surrender. We've returned to the battlefield, not to relive the victories, but to gather the personal impressions of those who lived in the islands or who fought their way through to liberate them at a time of tension and peril. Oh, not at all like the last time, I imagine.
No, it's not. Indeed, it was snowing, it was wet, it was cold, it was dark. It was a bit frightening in the middle of all the enemy.
Were they here to meet you?
No, my own people were.
By June the 14th, 1982, the Argentines were surrounded, and their general, Menendez, was waiting at his headquarters in the Falkland Islands Secretariat to sign the surrender document. For General Moore, the final walk towards this very ordinary building was the height of his professional career. He was a general who'd fought a war and won it. So this was just where they picked on this spot here?
Yeah, that's right. So, here it is then. This is the room, that's the table. I sat on that side over there, and Menendez on this side here.
He had the middle chair with his aides round about on either side.
That's right.
Did you have to do very much negotiating once you got here facing him?
No, I'd brought the surrender document which had been prepared with me. I put it on the table and presented it to him. He had a look at it. He didn't much like the word unconditional in front of surrendered, so we crossed it out. After all, if he was going to surrender, I didn't much care what the wording was as long as he did surrender. And he signed it and I signed it, and so there we were. The war was over and we all had tea.
Tea?
Tea it was.
The British had won. So, what was your mood at that moment? Were you tired, surprised, triumphant, what?
Relief, I think, without doubt. Relief that the war was over and the killing was stopping. After all, one doesn't become a soldier or stay a soldier because one enjoys war. It's not a pleasant thing. One's a soldier to prevent there being wars. I think it was Wellington who said after Waterloo that the next most miserable thing after a battle lost is a battle won.
You'd won a battle and that was a necessary evil.
That's right, yes.
It was a reversal of the emotions 10 weeks earlier when the Argentines had arrived to occupy the islands. Then they'd been victorious, and it was the islanders who'd been distraught and disoriented.
I couldn't actually believe it was happening. It seemed something that you usually see in films, and it was actually happening to us. Part of it was a vague fascination, an incredible curiosity that you actually wanted to go and look and see what was happening. And the other was just a fear of the unknown, of frightened for the children, an apprehension of not knowing what was going to happen, and quite a strong feeling, in fact, that you wanted to be with other people, a feeling that you wanted friends or even just acquaintances around about, and everybody in the same situation keeping together.
Britain responded to the islanders' plight with a sudden marshalling of naval power and a display of patriotic fervour not seen for decades. The speed with which the task force was dispatched left its members little time for second thoughts or self-doubt. They would come later. If there was a common emotion, it was surprise at the unusual strength of support they received. Sir Jeremy, how do you remember the week when the task force sailed?
That was a marvellous week. Perhaps the best of my service, in very many ways. The adrenaline was flowing. We were doing things for real. Everybody was full of enthusiasm, whether we're talking about Marines or soldiers embarking in ships, the ship's companies who were receiving them, the people who were working in the dockyards and in industry to provide us with what we wanted, and above all, a sense that it seemed the whole population was right behind what we were doing.
On the voyage south, I doubt if anyone didn't wonder about how they'd react if the shooting started to be real. In a few weeks, we'd all know the answer. But so long was it since Britain had been to war that the reservoir of past experience was tiny.
Mike Norman, who commanded the Marines in Stanley, as you know, when they got overran at the beginning, spoke at length to all of us on our way south. And the one question we all wanted to know is, what's it like to know you're going to die? And he said, it's no problem. You know, once you've made the decision, it's no problem. And I don't think any of us consciously thought of that while we were on Operation Corporate. But you don't, because it's always going to be somebody else.
The task force had a month to prepare itself before the first ships reached the South Atlantic battle zone. Then on May the 1st, HMS Glamorgan was bombed while bombarding the Falklands coast.
On the way down, a lot of the lads personally felt that nothing was going to come of it, you know, that the government would sort out a peace treaty, you know, and we'd all sail back again and nothing would happen, you know. And when the initial bombs started, when the aircraft started coming over, you know, it was an initial shock, really, but we got over that and just got down to doing what you had to do.
Glamorgan's captain, despite his 36 years in the Navy, discovered fear, and through it, a bond with his crew.
I think it was a fear of being attacked rather than the actual attack, which gripped most people. Once the attacks were on, or we were doing something to the enemy, then you forget fear. It's the waiting for fear, and it was the waiting particularly for people deep down in the ship with doing their job, perhaps felt fear more than any other.
Earlier that day, the British had launched their first air attacks. From the flight decks of Hermes and Invincible, the Sea Harriers set off to bomb Port Stanley airfield.
We all had our own butterflies, I'm sure. And when I got airborne on the first sortie, my squadron engineer said to me, "Goodbye, boss," which is a great way to start, which is a joke, really, but we didn't know what was going to happen. And as you know, the Argentinians had quite a superiority on paper against us, and we knew that we had to survive if the task force was going to continue. So there was a lot of responsibility, particularly on the younger chaps. And during the 1st of May, seeing chaps come down who'd been fired at by mirages, obviously not hit, it was a shock to the system.
What was it like being under fire for the first time?
It was very frightening for a fraction of a second. When you realise that there were actually people down there trying to put holes in your little pink body. But after the initial shock reaction, which, as I say, lasted for probably less than a second, then the brain just clicked into normal operating mode and carried on with it as if it were just a normal training exercise, really.
We didn't have any personal enmity that had grown up against the Argentine on the way down there. We just wanted to go out there and shoot down as many aircraft as possible, purely because it was a job.
The air raids of the 1st of May, including the remarkable bombing run from Ascension by an RAF Vulcan, created a sensation in Port Stanley. The Argentines were dismayed, the Falklanders, or at any rate their bolder spirits, celebrated.
We all greeted them very enthusiastically. In fact, the Argentine reaction was to get down into people's gardens, behind fences, hedges, anything else. Whereas we, few left in Stanley, would climb onto our shed roofs, on fences, just to see what was going on. And this did confuse the Argentines quite a lot, because they couldn't make out these mad Falkland people exposing themselves to so much danger.
An equal exuberance aboard the British ships was short-lived. May the 2nd saw the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano sunk by the British nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror. Sinking ships brings no pleasure to seamen. 2 days later, HMS Sheffield was struck by an Exocet missile in sight of the British fleet. Sobering evidence to all who saw that there was no turning back. Back at home, a second brigade of troops was dispatched aboard the QE2, this time with fewer flags and more tears. It was at this stage that General Moore decided to go south himself.
Of course, I didn't join QE2 when she sailed from England. I flew south and joined her off Ascension on her way by later on. That was because I stayed in England to help the Commander-in-Chief and to be at his hand whilst the decision was finally being made for the landing. Thereafter, I had the problem of whether I flew straight to the fleet and parachuted to get there quickly or went south in QE2. After all, whilst Brigadier Thompson was ashore with only one brigade, there wasn't really a job in that sense for me to do. But on the other hand, of course, I wasn't on the spot to help him in his communication back with England, or indeed to convey back to England on his behalf what was going on down there, leaving him free to fight his battle.
So being in a luxury liner wasn't fun, it was frustrating.
It was extremely frustrating. I had a lot of time when, because I didn't have the communications to be fully in the picture, I could do very little, and I could just really cogitate upon the fact that I was going to war.
While the General was all but incommunicado, 3 Brigade, the 1st Brigade to go south, reached the Falklands and landed. The single moment when the Argentines could break the back of the landing force and could be expected to try.
We went in the landing craft, which are the large landing craft with about 100 guys in each, and we didn't know a thing, how we were going to land, if it was an opposed landing or unopposed, if there was air cover or whatever. So once we got into the landing craft from Canberra, all weapons were pointing skywards, and it was quite a frightening experience. It was very worrying, actually, until we actually landed and got our feet on dry ground again.
Were you very keyed up?
Yeah, adrenaline was pumping like mad on everybody. And there was a silence. Nobody was talking. Everybody was eyes everywhere, looking for these aircraft to come in and thinking what could happen when we land. And we've practiced these beach landings. How will it be?
In fact, it was easy. The Marines and the Paras waded ashore and began to dig in. No opposition to begin with, but no slacking either.
The incentive we always give a soldier is if you don't do it the way we tell you you're going to do it, you're going to get killed. And all of a sudden they must have realised to a man that I think what we were taught in our depot days or in our pre-training days in the battalion, this incentive about us being killed if we don't do the job properly, I think it suddenly struck home. I think I better dig this trench a little bit deeper. I think I better clean this rifle 3 times a day, not just 1 time a day. I think I better look after my feet. I think I better take my socks off and check my feet. And all of a sudden it started to hit home, because I could see it from my position of just wandering around and talking to soldiers. The weapons were clean. The boots were clean. They'd shaven. The trenches, although they were full of water, couldn't have been any deeper. And I found on walking around and speaking to the soldiers, the conversation was more of a friend to a friend and not as standing to attention. Sir, I found it was a conversation that you could hold with them, and they would talk about themselves in the same vein as I would talk to my wife or my children or to friends within the Sergeant's Mess. When we moved up to Sussex Mountain, we were still at this stage not absolutely certain what was going to happen. And it wasn't until just after first light when one lone aircraft came over the top of us, which happened to be a Mirage of the Argentinian Air Force. And we actually took no notice of it. Everybody pointed, look, there's an aeroplane. Oh, it's a Mirage. And carried on. And then after the aircraft had flown by, he suddenly said, hold on. Oh, that's the enemy.
The aircraft made for the ships, immobilized in San Carlos water by the need to protect the troops ashore. Aboard HMS Fearless, the command ship, the naval commodore in charge of the whole operation could do nothing but sit out the storm.
I ended up most evenings feeling utterly exhausted. There's no doubt about that, and I think most of my staff felt the same. And it was very noticeable as the campaign went on that those who were on the upper deck and could actually see for themselves, and having got over the first sort of day of fear, which was with all of us really, first time you've been a coconut on a stall. They were coming down as though they'd seen the most marvellous Western movie, and it was all very exciting.
Beneath the bombs, the ships went on with their daily routine. Hot meals, warm beds, even television in the evening. Aboard the little boats scurrying about the anchorage, there was both discomfort and danger.
It's a tiny little plastic boat, and all the ships surrounding us were firing at the planes, and everybody was... everyone inland was firing at the planes, and we were sitting in the middle. Everything was just coming around us, and there's very little we could do.
Did you ever feel tempted to go over the side to get out of all that fire?
I did once, actually. I thought this plane was coming for me. I didn't realise that he's not really interested in one lone little person. He was going for... It was Ajax Bay behind me. And I actually switched the engine off and dived over the side. And there was only me in the boat. And the trouble was then I couldn't get back in. So I swam around to some slow hand claps from some sailors very close by, and eventually got back in the boat and carried on.
Commodore, you've got a very young family. Could you put them out of your mind while all this was going on?
I don't think I could put them out of my mind. They're part of my life, and they were an enormous strength to me. I used to get little letters from the children and drawings, and my cabin, as anybody will tell you, was fairly full of them. I actually saw one of them, actually, over the mantelpiece, which I wish I'd kept, but I'm afraid I didn't. And I was very conscious of them all the time, I think. No, there's no way you can put them out of your mind. I wanted to get back and to safety as much as anybody else down there, I think.
And yet you had to take very ruthless decisions. I mean, you were putting ships in vulnerable positions, that you were having to hazard them knowingly. Did you find you were more ruthless, perhaps, than you thought you might be?
No, I think I wouldn't have called them ruthless. They were calculated decisions done for the safety of the majority down there. And in order to achieve the safety of the majority, someone will probably have to take the risk and stand in the front line of fire. There's no avoiding that. You can't all hide behind everything. That is the role of the armed force, and that was the role of the escorts, to protect their protégés.
Ardent was the first escort to be sunk on the day of the landing itself. Her NAFI manager was in charge of one of her machine guns.
During the whole day, it just seemed one mass air attack. There was one point during the day where there was a brief lull, but it just seemed, for a few minutes, it just seemed that continuously from first light until the beginning of dusk that the ship was under attack.
Did you have time to think about what you were doing?
Not really. Only at one stage where I'd ran out of ammunition, and there was an aircraft, a Skyhawk, just coming in low at the ship. And the only thing then to do was to hit the deck, which I did. And it was just as the bombs were leaving the wings of the aircraft and passing through the rigging on the ship, it was only then that it sort of really brought home to me what was actually happening to the ship. And then as that aircraft passed over, somebody came up with some more belts of ammunition, and then we carried on.
Was it a wrench when the ship went down?
Yeah. Yes, it was. Yeah, it was funny to describe the feeling afterwards when I was on board the Cambering QE2. It was very disorientated. It was like having lots to do, and then being very busy, and then suddenly nothing. The only thing you could do day in, day out on the Cambering and on the QE2 is just do some reading or lie on your bunk and think about what had happened. It was very strange.
It wasn't just the Navy that lost ships. Atlantic Conveyor, a merchant vessel, waiting to move into Bomb Alley to unload, was struck by an Exocet and caught fire. The decision to abandon ship was taken by her two senior officers, Captain Ian North, the master who later drowned, and the senior naval officer on board.
It's a devastating decision to make, to abandon your ship. It must have crucified poor Ian North. It was a dreadful decision to have to make. But there became a time, quite clearly, that we should not stay.
And what happened to you when you got down and into the water? Was it a time of great physical struggle?
It was very hard work indeed, just simply to try and get to a life raft and get on board and prevent being sucked back towards the ship, which was very hard work, and I think John Brocklehurst had the same problem. It was only frightening, I found, in retrospect, funnily enough. I thought to myself, during it, I was really quite cool, I felt. I was underwater on one occasion for about 10 seconds. And you think, my goodness, is this really the end? But no panic, extraordinarily, no panic. And it wasn't until afterwards, and I thought about it, and I was warm and I'd had a cup of tea inside me, that it really came home to me how frightening it was.
We had 25, 26 in our raft, which is the full capacity, and it's quite crowded. And you're busy just keeping your next door neighbour awake if he's fallen asleep, that sort of thing.
Did you say there were people falling asleep?
Yeah, tiredness, fatigue is a great thing. Once you go over the side of a ship and you're in the water and then you're dragged in, it's surprising how tired you get. You have to force yourself to keep going.
The first of several field hospitals set up on the Falklands was on the shores of San Carlos. It too lay in the path of the Argentine air attack.
We were working on Argentinian at the time when they decided to pay us a visit and dropped 2 bombs which did not explode in the building. One went right through the attic space without exploding, and some more exploded in another wing, causing much chaos and death, of course.
Did you think you were safe because you were a doctor?
I went down with the preconceived idea that doctors and medical people, all Red Crosses, they were safe. But I found out differently when those bombs arrived, and I learned just how near I was to death. We were all told, it's all right, the bombs were dropped too low, they're not fused. But in fact, they were fused. It was just some pin had broken that stopped them from exploding.
The first major encounter with the Argentines on land came at Goose Green. Though outnumbered, 2 para defeated their opponents, who suffered heavy casualties. Their own casualties were officially described as light. But that's the military way of looking at it. 1/10 of those who took part were killed or injured. There's now a memorial to the British dead, one of the few landmarks on the empty, windswept terrain. The Falklands is not the best place for a set-piece infantry attack. I'm struck here by the openness of the ground and the lack of cover.
Yeah, absolutely, terribly open.
And what does that mean in military terms?
It means you're very exposed. It's most undesirable, but there's nowhere else to go here, of course.
It's been said, and said quite loudly, that this was a politician's battle. It was fought to keep the politicians happy. Would you go along with that?
No, I wouldn't go along with it. I know it's been said. But it had been my wish all the way along to get a battle won early. I think that all my reading of battles of the past and campaigns of the past has shown that the man who wins an early battle establishes a moral superiority over the enemy, which is very important. And I think that this battle gave me exactly that.
When we moved to Darwin and patrols at mark a start line, I was shit scared, basically. It dawned on me then, that it was going to happen. And they weren't going to surrender as we got there, and we're going to have to start doing attacks, but that's how I felt at the time.
Could you cope with that? I mean, were you able to get up and go on?
We had to, just follow the bloke in front and watch your back. Just keep on going.
Full in the path of 2 para was the handful of houses making up the settlement of Darwin. The few islanders still living there found themselves caught in the crossfire between the 2 sides.
We went into the dining room and tried to kip down there for a little while, but that was no good, and we eventually finished up on the floor in the kitchen during the dark part of the night. And the shelling went on from 7:45 until around about 2 o'clock in the morning, and then everything went quiet, and then we happened to look out of the window, which compulsive to look out of windows, of course, and the whole place was as bright as day, and it was then that the 2 para started their attack.
Worst of all was when the Argentines started shelling, and the radiators were clanking and vibrating, and that was my most frightening time, I think.
Did you, during that day, try to keep up a normal routine?
No, we tried to have breakfast, and it wasn't very successful. We didn't feel like eating. Biscuits just tasted sawdust.
How did lunch go?
Oh, we had lunch, yes, because our part of the battle was over then. We'd seen a British helicopter and we weren't afraid at all then. We knew the battle was well underway.
It was during the battle that you got hit and you lost your leg. What happened and did you know what was going on when you were wounded?
Yeah, I was aware of what's happening. I just had a numb feeling from the waist downwards. I was lying on my stomach and I was just reaching up for my weapon, and all I got was like a thud. All I heard was a large thudding sound, and I thought I was all right. I didn't feel any immediate pain, and then when I looked down, I saw the damage to my leg, and then I screamed because then I think it took a couple of seconds to register to my brain that I'd been hit, and then after that I just got a drowsy sensation after a couple of hours, but I had no sort of pain. It was just numb from the waist downwards. I didn't know I had any damage to my other leg at all at the time.
How long was it before you knew that you'd lost the leg?
Oh, near enough knew immediately just by looking at it. You know, the bone had gone. It was just flesh that was keeping my foot holding on.
What did you think about when you realised that?
I thought lots of things. I thought if I was going to make it or not, you know. When it got past the 2-hour stage, I thought, oh, no one's coming now. And when it got to 4 hours, someone did come, but...
Before they picked you up?
Yeah, it was 4 hours of Corporal Ty and I were lying there. But, no, I was talking to Corporal Ty, and he was the bloke I went back for. And we were talking about who's going to buy the first pint when we got back to England. Of all the things to talk about when you're lying there, but I suppose it's just one way, you know, we were talking to him, and he was reassuring me by saying someone's going to be here soon, like, it'll be all right, like. And
you were working out your chances of survival?
I was just, basically, yeah, I was just sort of saying to me, like, I was getting more and more drowsy. You know, my sight was getting worse. It was like getting very blurred vision. But then, once someone got to me, I had a big sigh of relief. I thought that was it, I'm saved, like, sort of thing. And I just remembered parts of the journey on the way back.
You're a doctor, you're a surgeon. You're probably more used to most people than seeing blood and injuries. Did that mean that you were not as affected as other people were by some of the injuries that were coming in?
No, I was affected by some of the wounds. The higher the velocity, the worse the wound. But the worst ones were really the anti-personnel ones, the mines that affected the feet. It was very distressing to see a young man coming in maimed with a foot hanging on with a bridge of skin and having to realise that he's going to lose it and you cannot save it. Very distressing until you get used to it, but even so, I did not get used to it.
The next link in the medical chain was the hospital ship SS Uganda, better able to deal with the worst injuries.
Oh, it was terrific. It was a great laugh on the Uganda. The atmosphere was great. It wasn't at first when I first woke up, because I was in intensive care. But when we got to on the Seaview ward with all the other lads, it was like the morale was brilliant, terrific. Like especially the lads in my regiment, and even the Navy lads and the rest of them that were all there. We were all just sort of, no one sort of cared about their injury, because there were so many of you. You know, no one was bad because everyone was bad. If you know what I mean.
What were the sort of things you talked about then?
Women, drink, all the joys of life that we're going to get when we get home. That's what we were saying anyway. But when I woke up on the hospital ship for the first time, when I woke up, the nurses told me that I'd lost my leg, like, and they were all serious and everything. And I lifted up the blankets, and all I could see was a mass of bandages from the waist, like, around my stump and on this leg. And I said, well, I've still got my bollocks, and and I don't know how they took it. I don't know if they took it a good way or not, because one couldn't work out, I don't think, how I could be so happy, like, you know, and joke about it straight away. But the other one, you know, they thought it was quite funny, and after that, it just, everything got on all right, like.
They weren't all as resilient, but the Uganda nurses noted how the patients helped each other.
There was a Royal Marine corporal who used to organise 20-minute moan sessions in an afternoon. They could all moan for 20 minutes, and then that was it for the afternoon. They all had to get better after that. So there were some very humorous, nice times, really. It wasn't all depressing at all, as people think. A lot of the humour was black humour and would horrify anybody on a normal ward. But in there, it didn't seem out of place. A lot of servicemen together.
Can you give me an example of the sorts of things that happened like that?
Well, chaps who'd maybe had traumatic amputations, their friends would make them parrots and give them to them, and you would perhaps be absolutely astounded by that at home, but you know, they all laughed about it with each other. It seems incredible, really, now looking back to it.
How did you cope with the men who had worries about what would happen when they got home?
That was possibly the most difficult thing we did have to come to terms with. Lots of men worried about how they would cope financially, or would their wives accept them, or how could they tell their mums on the phone that they'd lost a leg. And that was very difficult. It really took not only our time, but all sorts of people's time. The P&O staff, although not all of them were medical, were very good in just talking to the men. Lots of men wanted men to talk to. The chaplains were very good speaking to them about that.
How did you deal with it? Did you get examples like that?
Oh, certainly, yes. A chap said to me that his wife wouldn't want him when he got home. He said his wife was very young, and I said, oh, she'll still love you when you get home, you know, even though you're injured. And he said, well, it's different from you. You're a nurse, and you understand, and you're older. And that was very difficult to answer, because I didn't know his wife at home, and I didn't know what to say, to be quite honest, because I did understand, and he was obviously going to get better, although it was going to be a long job. But he just couldn't come to terms with that. What would his wife say? And perhaps that was the worst thing for them when they did get home. It was fine when we were all together and everybody used to chat and how they were doing, but when they got home and they were one in one house, possibly the most difficult bit of it all.
What about with the Argentinians, because they were fed in through the same system?
Well, certainly they were treated exactly the same as the British servicemen. I did think at first it would be very awkward to have, say, an Argentinian between an army chap in between a Marine, but in fact there was no problem at all. And although most of the Argentinians couldn't speak English, and not many of our chaps could speak Spanish, they did build up a rapport. And often when the Argentinians went home, they left their rosaries, their crucifixes to the man in the next bed. And it was very touching. That's all they had in the world with them.
After the battle, a time to consider. Because events moved so quickly, most men found fighting easier than they'd expected. The harder task was to collect and bury the dead, the bodies of close friends.
Getting them back down to San Carlos Water was the one time in the whole of that campaign, and something I will always think about for the rest of my days, was being there with the medics and the surgeon, stripping them so that all you had left outside on a piece of concrete slab was 18 of my comrades, standing there with the medical surgical commander, checking the entry and exit wounds, signing for their personal effects, the small amount of personal effects that they had on them. And that is something I will never ever forget.
What was the effect of that on you?
Tremendous. You don't. I haven't spoken about it. I mean, I haven't spoken about it to my family. But it's something that I will always remember. Not by rank. They weren't laid out by rank. There was no uniform sort of parade. There was 18 soldiers, including one Royal Marine engineer called Amelia, who was with us at that time, who was unfortunately killed. You know, to see them actually there, stripped of everything, to be placed inside the body bag before we actually then interred them, just above the whaling station itself, is something I will never ever forget.
Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan, Corporal Fryer, Lance Corporal Cork, Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley, Private Holman Smith, Private Fletcher, Private Illingsworth, Private Meakin, Private Dixon.
Hard on the heels of the victory at Goose Green came the reinforcements of 5 Brigade. They were greeted with a curious resentment by some of the troops already on the ground, who feared the newcomers would steal their part in future battles. With them came General Moore, released at last from the confinement of the QE2, anxious to see and act for himself. Did you have principles on which you set out to fight the campaign, for your own personal conduct, for the way you were doing it?
Yes, I think one does. I think that there's no doubt that one's day was going to be occupied in being with one's subordinate commanders and the men and the units all around, and there was lots of them, of course, and there was a great deal of getting around and having the feel of things. I think one has grown up learning that a very important factor in one's mind is having the feel of the battlefield, and I think it is part of one's reading of military history that where people have not had the feel of the battlefield, they haven't really managed to succeed.
This was what, a throwback to the First World War? When
Well, I think the First World War was a very big influence in all our backgrounds and our reading, and I think that is absolutely true, yes, and the way they were tended to be detached from what was going on in the front line.
Too many generals dining by candlelight away from the troubles.
Well, I think that's the way many people saw it, certainly, yes.
There wasn't an element of that in this war, though, was there, where you came back to the command ship Fearless each night and you were away from the battlefront and you were actually warm and dry and comfortable?
There was an element of worry about coming back to Fearless. I had to come back because that was where my headquarters was. But for good naval reasons, which I didn't then and don't now dispute, from time to time, Fearless had to go away from here at night to do various tasks. And I always found myself extremely uncomfortable when that was happening, saying to my staff, can't I get ashore, can't I get ashore? Because there was always the feeling that you never know, by morning there might have been a submarine popped up or something, and we shall then find ourselves 120 miles the wrong way, and I'm cut off from the battle.
The load of leadership was more literally felt by the junior officers and NCOs. They had to keep their heavily burdened men marching across expanses of uneven, squelchy Falklands countryside. They encouraged and bullied, threatened and promised, but primarily set an example by making light of equipment weighing 100 pounds or more.
Once it's on your back and you get moving, you're all right. It's when you start to move off and lift the pack up from the ground onto your back and get moving again. That's the hardest point. But once you're moving, you can keep on going. It doesn't seem so bad.
Did everybody manage all right, or did some people have to be encouraged along a bit?
Just got to encourage them on, keep them going, tell them to be resting in 10 minutes or whatever. Tell them we've been going so many hours and you're going to have a rest after this. Just keep them going. Tell them we can't stop here. We've got to keep on going. There's no way we can go back. It's not like training. You just got to keep on going.
But what is it that keeps people going under those circumstances? Is it fear of staying on, fear of being left, determination, letting your mates down?
I think most of it is determination, plus letting your mates down. You don't want to let your mates down, especially if you know they're carrying the same weight as you, so you can't grumble at them. You can't start swearing at them or nothing like that. You can't say, well, you're carrying less than what I am carrying, because everybody was carrying about the same, give or take 2 or 3 pounds.
Amongst them were the genuine enthusiasts who regarded the prospect of danger with satisfaction.
I found a lot of the things we did very exhilarating. In the exhilaration of doing things that are potentially dangerous is probably one of the things that will always send men to war. I don't know. There's no greater buzz than surviving something.
And knowing that you risked your life in the process.
Well, knowing that possibly you risk your life in the process, although it's not a conscious thing. You don't. It's very difficult to explain. You don't consciously think, I am risking my life. It just doesn't occur. You just go out and do what you're told to do.
Whatever happens, with modern weapons, there are going to be casualties. We normally, in our way of thinking, we write off a third after each attack, which are a lot of guys. But I don't think it ever crosses your mind it could be you.
I think the only thing you're really afraid of is being afraid. I think it probably sounds strange, but the real fear is not the fear of death or injury or anything like that. It's the fear of being afraid and not being able to cope with it. Everybody's afraid. Anybody who says he's not afraid is a liar. But it's the ability to be afraid and to either work through it or ignore it. That's the thing.
My wife had asked me what would happen if I get injured or if I die or whatever. And I said to her, I won't. I'm too good. They won't get me. All right, that's a bit of propaganda, I think, but it calmed her down. and it made her think, I think it made her think, that he'll be all right. Myself, I knew I was going to come back. I don't know how or what it was, but something said, yeah, you'll be coming back.
The attack on Sir Galahad was a brutal demonstration that experience matters. The soldiers aboard, relative newcomers, hadn't seen for themselves the power of the Argentine Air Force, hadn't sought the relative safety of the shore. 48 died aboard Sir Galahad, another 2 aboard Sir Tristram, which was anchored nearby, and later brought round, fire-damaged, to Port Stanley. We're back on the deck of Sir Tristram, where the memorial service was held after the joint disaster, really, at Fitzroy. What do you remember of the memorial service?
Very moving occasion. I remember particularly well standing on the deck of this ship and the scene looking over towards Galahad before she was towed out to be sunk at sea as a war grave, and finding it very moving indeed. I think it was perhaps one of the more moving moments during the campaign, though there were others.
Can you allow yourself the luxury of shock in a situation like that, or do you have, as a general, to start planning and moving on again, to pick up the pieces?
You have, of course, got to pick up the pieces, but I think that one would be less than human if one didn't feel these things, and I don't think that it would be right to deliberately set about protecting oneself from them. I wouldn't wish not to understand the shock and unpleasantness of war at all, and I think that provided one has trained oneself throughout one's time to be prepared for such shocks, and whilst I had never met anything quite on that scale personally before, I'd read much about it, of course, and I think that one's years of preparation led to that sort of thing.
You take the risk of it feeding through into your decision-making, perhaps influencing you?
Well, that's a very good question, of course, whether it does feed through into one's decision-making. I think it does in the sense that one is always conscious and anxious not to have unnecessary casualties or to take unnecessary risks. But one has to remember, and I think one of my reactions to it was to be the more determined to get on and finish this thing quickly, because that in the long run remains the way to avoid unnecessary casualties.
But casualties there were on both sides. The Harrier pilots were being hardened by their experience. After hundreds of sorties, they'd shed any early chivalrous notions. Do you feel any sense of remorse at shooting down other pilots?
No, I should in a sense. I smile because we had thought that if we shot down, for example, a Hercules, we'd fly alongside and say, wave at them and say, look, out you get, because we didn't really want to go and shoot down a team of men, maybe soldiers, whatever, unnecessarily. As it happened, when I shot down a Hercules, there wasn't any time. We were very short of fuel, a very long way from home, and we just hit it hard, fired everything I had at it, and it went straight into the water. I was full of glee after that, because we've been trying to get a Hercules for a long time. I was like a little schoolboy in the cockpit, to be honest. And we got home extraordinarily short of fuel, but in a very happy frame of mind. There was no personal enmity involved. There was just the success of shooting down the enemy air assets. That was what it was all about. And if a man survived, like my chap out of my Picara survived, Major Tombo, delighted.
How do you resolve that? How can you be happy one minute to be shooting somebody down and the next relieved that he's escaped?
Well, it's something which I thought about for some time to try and identify, because obviously it is a contradiction in terms. But I think the answer really is that compassion is the victor's prerogative. That part of the fight was now over. He had lost, I had won. He was no longer a threat, and therefore I could afford to feel compassion for him.
On the ground, the main battles for the hills around Port Stanley were about to be fought. The British were already firmly established in the mountains, in sight of Stanley and within artillery range of the Argentines. If you were up here and under attack, was that the right thing for a general to be doing?
I wasn't up here during the night attacks. There was nothing I could gain by being here during the night attacks, and that probably would have been quite unnecessary exposure. But I think to be forward, to get the feel of the battlefield and to be up here during the day with the members of my command, when I could come out here and talk to them all and have a look at how things were going, is the right way to behave.
Were you under attack yourself?
We were shelled while I was up here, yes.
Were you scared?
I don't think I was, actually, greatly, no. Not nearly so frightened of the prospect once one is up amongst the shelling and things as one is thinking about it beforehand.
Putting personal fears on one side, what professionally were you most worried about at this stage in the campaign?
Oh, undoubtedly, of the whole thing hanging up and getting stuck here for one reason or another. We must get on and get down there into Stanley, because I didn't want to have to fight out the winter with us up here in the mountains in all the cold and difficulty of that sort, where the enemy had shelter on the town at his back. The longer things went on, the more my assets would diminish. And therefore, the more, in the end, the more casualties from weather or the enemy that I would take.
It's a very humane approach, and you have said that you believe in being a professional soldier, but if the humane approach didn't work, could you go on being a soldier?
That's a difficult question, isn't it? Because, of course, it's hypothetical, and I've never had to face it.
But humanity works, doesn't it? What I'm asking is, if it didn't, could you face that?
Humanity works because we all understand that to make it work, we've all got to be hard with ourselves. And that includes generals making hard and difficult decisions, which one is conscious are going to lead to casualties. And, of course, corporals make decisions that are going to lead to casualties. So it applies to all of us. And I think, if I may go back for 20 years, I remember people saying to me after an action we were in then, that by golly they'd hated the training period before, but the moment the bullets started flying they realised what it had all been about. And I think that that is the thing. One learns as a soldier that a great deal of sweat and hard work and unpleasantness actually saves blood.
The bloodiest battle was for Mount Longdon, taken by 3 para.
When you go for a position like that, you think, well, it's not going to happen to me. Because if you go up there thinking, well, I'm going to get killed, you're wasting your time. You never get up there. You've got to go up there and say, well, put it in your back of your mind, say, well, it's not going to be me, or it's not going to be any of my lads. I'm not sure you do. You do your job and try and get up there in one piece. If you get it, it's just luck.
It's funny, after I was taken down first in the hip, I thought, well, you know, it didn't hurt, as I thought. It was a burning sensation very quickly. And then I moved later on and the enemy shot me again. Again, all it was a quick burning sensation. But after that, I felt I wanted to go home, and I knew somebody was going to come up and get me.
Colour Sergeant Faulkner, it was you who got him out, and others. Was it the fact that you had to lead by example that made you go and do it?
No, because at that time I was given the responsibility of getting those wounded soldiers out. And I felt obliged to those soldiers because, such as Graham, who stood next to me, I mean, he's a personal friend. We served in B Company together for years. I've known them, we played football together. Some of those soldiers out there I took through as corporals when I was here as a corporal in the depot. I felt that it wasn't leadership. I felt that I was responsible. I had to go and get those lads. And I had to give myself a kick up the backside to go out and get them.
Did you have to make hard decisions about not going out if you weren't going to get somebody back?
Yeah, yes, it was difficult. I mean, as I said before, there was a friend out there that eventually died. I mean, I could hear him. We could hear him talking, and I just couldn't get to him.
Corporal Heaton, you lost a leg.
Yeah.
Would you still feel the same? Would you still give people the same advice?
Yeah, I'll do it again.
Would you go back?
I would go back again, yeah.
Why?
Because I was fighting for a worthwhile cause. It's like people in the last war lost legs. They didn't turn around and say, well, I lost a leg, it wasn't worth doing. It's exactly the same now. But it doesn't bother me. I've adapted myself, and you just got to carry on with life as it is.
By now, all units were clamouring to be involved.
If we jumped all the way across there and not done any fighting, I think we would have felt disappointed about it.
So instead you felt a bit pleased?
Yes, in a way. That we done some fighting at last. Because if we walk across there carrying all the kit, we just thought, well, if we don't do any fighting, we'll think we've seen off or something like that.
Not sorry to be fighting?
No. I think when we did do the actual fighting, we were glad we were doing something. Because if you're just marching day in, day out, sometimes it gets a bit boring, really.
Which is worse, being in a battle or watching one?
Watching one.
Why?
I don't know. It's a strange feeling. You think there's so much ammunition changing sides. You think the casualties must be absolutely phenomenal. But I can only talk the one battle I was in, which was Mount Harrier. There was a lot of ammunition changing sides there, and yet the casualties were very minimal. Whether it was our training again that brought us through, or what, I don't know. But I would rather be in it because the adrenaline takes over from the fear, and you just get up and go.
The last battle, to clear Mount Tumbledown, fell to the Scots Guards. It proved to be one of the most difficult and led to the closest fighting of the campaign.
But when we went up there, we couldn't see anybody for a start. We could hear them, because I don't suppose it was that far away from us, but it was pitch black. It wasn't what I had fixed in my mind.
Did hearing them and knowing something about them make it easier or harder?
Harder. When I first heard them, that's when I thought to myself, what have I let myself in for?
Because they were people or because you were afraid?
Because they were people. Because you could actually hear that they were people.
My platoon sergeant was killed right at the front, right at the start, and he was terribly good friends with a lot of the section commanders and the guardsmen. They absolutely worshipped him. And I think some of the guardsmen got very angry when he was killed. And it became actually a sort of vendetta against the people that had shot him. They went out to kill Argentinians. And then it became for them very personal. In other words, they were settling a score.
Did you encourage that or try and stop it?
I didn't do anything about it. It just happened, really. As far as I was concerned, again, this sounds awfully sort of callous. As far as I was concerned, if it helped them to do the job, fine, as long as they didn't go overboard.
And later on, you shot people. Did you find that was something you could do?
I found I could do it, yeah.
Even though they were people?
Yes.
Didn't think about it?
No.
How did you feel about the death of your sergeant, about the death of other members of your platoon?
Oh, gosh. I was terribly angry at them for being shot. My first reaction was blast. I've just lost some good soldiers who would have helped me to carry out what I had to do. That's my first reaction, was to be very angry. And I remember coming up to my platoon sergeant as he was on the ground and kicking his helmet, which was lying beside him, thinking, damn, you know, I need you now, where are you? It was only later that you actually start to think, I've lost a very good friend here, and it becomes a bit more emotional.
What was the emotion when you heard there'd been a surrender?
I remember feeling completely numb. I thought, well, great, I can get off this blasted mountain. There wasn't any particular elation about the whole business. I didn't feel sad that we'd done it all for nothing or anything like that, because that wasn't true. I just remember thinking, wow, I can go now. That's it. And I remember shuffling off that mountain like a 90-year-old. It took me about an hour to get down the blasted thing. Thinking, well, wow, all that for this.
So when the end came and the Argentinian collapse started, it was very sudden. Were you as taken aback as everybody else seemed to be by the speed of it?
No, I don't think I was entirely taken aback. After I'd been up here, and or rather over there on Goat Ridge, and talked to my brigadiers, I'd gone back to my headquarters, and I'd been thinking to myself, it's time they surrendered. They've fought their battles, they've been beaten. In fact, I walked around outside my tent, sort of kicking the grass and saying, why will we have this man surrender? he must surrender soon. And then I'd sort of overcome that bit and gone back in the tent and was sitting down thinking about the next phase, which I'd given orders for when I was up here, and how that was going to go and things. And then suddenly somebody came, of course, and said that they were standing around on the tops of the hills and the white flags were appearing.
And relief all round.
And relief all round. And then the tension of beginning to start thinking about negotiating this surrender.
No more opening fire. No more opening fire. No more opening fire.
The walk into Port Stanley was a walk back to reality. After weeks caught up in a military machine dedicated to a single aim, the soldiers could hope that it had been achieved and they could start to find themselves as people again.
The feelings were, is it or isn't it? If it is, euphoria. And made you say, this is it, we're going home. Because there was no way that we were going to not go home now. And this was reflected throughout the whole of our battalion. And actually seeing 3 Parrot coming down off Mount Longdon, when arriving by ourselves, all of a sudden took off their steel helmets and placed on their red beret. And then we then set off into Port Stanley, and it was unbelievable, unbelievable. Adrenaline's still running at this stage, because you don't know whether it is over, but at the bottom of your heart, it's over. You know, please, nobody tell us it's not over. It is over, it's finished.
At the Secretariat, as the Argentine general moved out, the British general moved in to set up his headquarters. General Moore and his men still had much to do. For the islanders, a friend had replaced a foe. The military aim had been achieved, but the aftermath was something they now had to live with.
I felt very upset about the desolation as it was around me, not having properly looked at the place for a long time, and actually looking at it and seeing as it was then, an incredible feeling of sadness came over me. But I think it's the same. I mean, I assumed it was the adrenaline had gone away, and you realised it was over, and there was all sorts of things that you could think about that in fact you don't think about up until that point because you're so busy surviving and looking after other things.
I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at first. I just ended up crying. So pleased.
How did you hear?
General Moore came to the west door, which was a safe area, and we were kicked out of our house and taken to there.
And what did he do?
He just told us, came in and told us he'd surrendered, and then stayed for a little while and then left.
Did people make a fuss of him?
Yeah.
What did they do?
Well, they were sort of gave him drinks and shaking hands and everything.
And you burst into tears?
Yeah, I think I was about the only person that didn't shake his hand.
For the men of the task force, it was simpler. Like all victors, they were glad they'd come, and now they were glad to be going. Are the memories good ones, bad ones?
Both. It's nearly a year now, and you tend to forget a lot of the bad ones, and just remember the funny ones, and the laughs are the same as everything.
What's the best one?
I think coming back. Really, we didn't come back on the camera. We landed a day before at the airfield, and that was just incredible. We flew back from Ascension. The feeling then, never. Well, I hope I never do have to repeat that actually, but I think that's the best memory of the lot. The rest we tend to sort of put in little boxes. I think little boxes in the mind.